Well, hey guys, welcome back to my workbench world of modeling. Dan here as always, and in this video we're going to be looking at another covered hopper weathering video. This one is a really interesting one. Here we have an Athearn Genesis FURX exROCK 3-bay center flow covered hopper. These are pretty popular prototypes. I'm glad they actually did a model of this, and these cars are really nice because they're pre-weathered and they're pre-patched, so it saves some modelers some time. There are some slight discrepancies with the patchwork, and it's unfortunate, but I'm actually not going to change it on this model. Main thing is that the reporting marks on the ends should be shifted over a little bit, but because they're already on the car and I don't really want to change it, I'm just going to leave those as they are. If you wish to change that, that's easy. You just would basically scrape those off, repaint that area with some acrylic, and then just basically re-decal it with the Smokebox Graphics FURX decal sheet. So in this case, again, I'm just starting from scratch with this car, but it is pre-faded, so it's got the right shade of blue that we need to start, and the patching is already done for us, which will save us some time. So what we're going to be focusing on mainly is rusting it up, which is obviously what I want to focus on. And you can see I've already kind of pre-disassembled it, and I've dull coated it ahead of time with a little bit of Tester's dull coat. I've taken off the trucks and prepped those and set those aside. I've also removed the air hoses on this car because they're the crappy new Genesis air hoses which keep breaking off, so I just went ahead and popped them off anyway, and I'll probably just replace them with some beefier, bulkier KD air hoses in the end. The other thing I've done is I've actually popped the hatch off the top of the car, so if you can see, it comes right off, and we have the entire top exposed, which will be handy for weathering, because on the top of this car it is completely rusted over, and then that rust streaks down the side of the car. So I'm going to be keeping this off and doing some rust work to it separately afterwards once it basically gets reinstalled. So we'll be setting that aside, and overall it's pretty much ready for the actual weathering process. And to start off, we're going to be doing some airbrushing to the top, but before we do that, let's look at the prototype. Here's the real car, and as you can see, it's a really good example of the fine rust streaking I like to do with oils. It's got a lot of good kick up and grime on the underbody, so we're going to be focusing a lot of grime work on the underbays there with the airbrush. The trucks are nicely rusted up, the ends are nicely dirtied up. You got a little bit of graffiti on this end bay here that we'll have to be replicating, and then you can see all the fine streaks of rust coming down from the top portion of the car. You got some salt streaking as well, the patchwork's wearing out, and then you got tons of that good grime work at the base of the car. So this is all going to be done with oils. We're going to be doing some light work to the logo to pre-fade that up a little bit and age it ahead of time, and then just a couple other little enhancing things to kind of get this car prepped up and ready to go. So there's that shot. Again, talking about the roof, see, if we look at the roof here, there's a really good shot of what's going on. The walkways are all rusted up. The top is completely rusted away, but it's covered in salt. As you can see, it's starting to streak down. The hatch is nice and clean, but the lock bars and the joints there, the little hinges, are rusted up, so we'll be replicating that all the way down the side. But there's a really good look at that rust, so we'll be layering that on with an airbrush with some acrylic first, and then we'll follow back behind with a heavy layer of oils to replicate that. There's that logo. It's all faded up. And then again, all that salt streaking, which we'll come back to later. But overall, this looks hard at first, but with some basic techniques, we'll be able to actually accomplish this relatively quickly and easily. So this will be a good car for this demonstration. One of the harder parts will be this. As you can see on this opposite side of the car, there's some graffiti that I want to replicate, so I'll be hand painting that when we get to it. I'll be going over that really shortly. So that'll be fun. So this car's got a little bit of everything. It's got some good rust, it's got some load spillage, it's got a lot of rust, a lot of grime, and it's got graffiti. So it's kind of a really good car in that respect for trying to capture a lot of different techniques in one model. So let's go ahead and not waste any time. We'll jump right into this car. And the first thing we're going to do is some airbrush work. First thing I'm going to do is blast the underbody with the grime, and in this case I'm using straight earth brown Anita's acrylic. I have a large bottle of it here, and I've diluted the paint down with 70% isopropyl alcohol, and the consistency I'm going for is a nice thick even layer of just dark brown. In some cases you can darken it up a little bit with a little bit of flat black, but in this case I'm going straight earth brown, not only for the underbody but also for the top of the car when we get to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've started my airbrush up. I got it set at 40 psi, and I have my consistent paint here nicely mixed up and ready to go. I'll be installing that in my dual action airbrush here. And again, remember, I've dull coated all this ahead of time so the paint will stick real nicely. So what we're going to do is I generally will start around the coupler box area, and I'll build the paint up pretty quickly, just like this. just to get things kicked off. You see I'm going to start layering that paint on. And you got to remember that you got to hit these things up at different angles so that everything is properly shaded together. So as you go, you paint everything up and you keep moving. You don't let the paint build up in one spot. You just sort of, you have to keep working it into different areas. Now the airbrush, of course, is only going to get so much done and so much covered. There's still going to be a few little areas of shading that we won't be able to get to as easily. But for the most part, this will help fill it in relatively quickly. And then we can go back in with a brush later with oils, and we'll be able to correct any little mistakes, and we'll be able to actually darken everything up a little bit. So now I'm going to go ahead and spray the bays, if I don't get any water in that mix. I'm going to go ahead and spray that paint around a little bit. There's a little bit of water in my brush there, that's why it's doing that. But if you do get water in your line like that, just spray your airbrush a little bit on your scrap paper until you can get all that paint or that water kind of cleared out, because it'll keep messing with you. It'll keep spraying water like it just did there, which is really, really annoying. Come on. That's annoying. Alright. So basically what I'm going to do, just go down the entire portion of this car until I get everything loaded up. And then repeat the process on the ends, and again, just remember to hit up all your different angles. Now that I've got the underbody completed in terms of airbrush work, let's go ahead and hit the top up. And again, this is a very thick, heavy layer of acrylic. I'm going to start spraying it in like this. Work it around the railings first, and spray in layers. Just like if you were painting a car, you want to make sure that you're doing even layers at a time and you don't let it build up too quick. Just work it out real slowly until you get everything filled in. Just like that. You can see it doesn't take long. Very simple to do. Now, work that paint in the top sill of the car like this. The slope sheet, rather. Build it up. Watch out for the kind of shadowing that you'll get. I'll show you here in a second. There. So you can see that does not take long at all, but what ends up happening is you get this shading where you can see the little areas behind those slats that support the roof walk. We need to get rid of those. So what I'm going to do, come in at a different angle, put a little bit of paint on those. Doesn't have to be perfect. Remember that I'm going to be going in here and I'm going to be applying oil as well. So this is only the first stage. Just repeat that for the opposite side as well, and just make sure that you get everything very evenly blended out. Well, it's not exactly beautiful, but we do got the base coat of paint we need for the following steps. So again, the underbody is done up and the top is done up. Now the thing that happens when you airbrush stuff like this in this kind of quantity, you end up getting a lot of splatter on the side, and a lot of stuff will get kind of splattered around, and that's just the nature of airbrushing. You have to kind of be careful, but stuff will generally splatter on the side. And because this is acrylic and because the car is sealed up, we don't have to worry about the paint sticking. Simply take a wet Q-tip and start wiping it away. Just start at one corner of the car at a time. Be careful not to snag up on anything like soft, delicate railings or things like that, and just quickly rub the paint off like this. There we go. Alright, quick and simple, you know, no sweat there. Just get everything cleaned up. As for when you get to the top area like this, just be really careful coming up. I don't want to take away that paint off that ledge, so just kind of work very carefully and slowly around that and build it up. Again, if you make some mistakes, don't worry about it. We'll be filling all this in with some oils later and everything will nicely blend together. So I'm going to go ahead, clean this car body up, and then the next step here will be to dull coat all of our airbrush work in. We need to make sure that everything's sealed in before we do any kind of oil work, because if you you try to put oils over this fresh acrylic paint without sealing it in, it'll just scrape right back off the factory color. I've applied all of the clear coat to this car and everything's sealed up. We're going to go ahead and switch up to the oils, and as demonstrated in a couple other videos, I like to use oils to enhance some of the work, especially on these bays and the coupler box area. I'm not going to worry too much about the interior here. You're not going to see this. If you want to weather this up, you can. That would all just pretty much mostly be rust, of course. But again, we're going to be focusing on this interior. So what I got here is a little cap of paint thinner, and a lot of people ask me all the time, do you choose paint thinner or mineral spirits? Really, with water mixable oils, any kind of oil in general, I like to use just regular, well, clean strip paint thinner. If I can zoom in real quick. This stuff is really good, and again, it's maybe like $3 or $4 from Walmart, and it'll last you quite a long time. You don't need to buy professional model thinners. These work just as fine, and I use them with my airbrush too. Anyways, I got a little cap of that here, and in terms of oil, I'm going to be using Winsor & Newton water mixable oils. Oopsie. And as you can see, I have burnt umber, my trusty color. This is a great rust tone. This, coupled with some raw sienna and some other colors, will give you some great rust effects. As for brushes, I'm going to be using a large liner brush here. It's a little frayed out to apply the paint. You can use a flat bristle brush like this or a fine tip like this as well. I'll be using a combination of those. First off, what I like to do, load my bristles with a little bit of thinner, wipe some of it off. I will load some of the oil paint, which is basically in a paste form, and I'll put it on a piece of paper. I'll pick a little bit up on my bristles that are wet with the thinner, and then I can go in and I can transfer this paint to the areas that I need. So in this case, I'm just going to start applying it to the coupler box, and make sure you keep your strokes pretty even here. Try to tuck those bristles into all the nooks and crannies, and this is the point in time too where you correct any kind of shadowing that you might have left over from the airbrush, because the airbrush has a hard time getting in all those little cracks and crevices and covering everything completely. So the brush is where you can fine-tune all that and change up everything. Also remember with oils that you need to work smartly with the areas that you're working on. Generally, you don't want to handle these oils for a couple hours while they dry. Even with thinner, which helps to kind of set them up a little bit faster compared to if you were just doing with water. They still stay a little bit tacky for a little bit of time, and you want to be aware of that. So you just kind of need to work in small areas at a time, and generally with these kinds of cars, I will hit the underbody up first, then I will move kind of to the ends, and then to the top, and then to the sides. That way, while the ends or the top or whatever is drying, I can move the car around and work on another part of it without getting my hands in and all that fresh weathering work that I've just done. Because again, you do pose the risk of accidentally putting your fingers in some of that rust or something like that that you've applied, and getting it all over your fingers, which is not fun, and I don't recommend that you try to do that. So again, just kind of work with the paint one little bit at a time, and here you can see it applies very quickly, and you just kind of randomly apply it. If you need to kind of thin certain spots out, which in this case I'm going to hit these bays with a little bit of thinner to kind of let that paint flow a little bit more, you can. As you can see, once you kind of puddle the thinner up, it starts to run a little bit, and you get this really cool effect where it looks like it's starting to kind of wash down, and that's a technique a lot of modelers will use. They'll just try to kind of let the acrylic or oil kind of pool up like that, because you can also do that technique with acrylic as well. And then same thing on this side. Now for the area over here, I'm going to leave that completely rusted, because that's going to be where all that grime and kick up is going to be from those wheels, so we're not going to worry about that too much. So along with the underbody, which is nicely wrapped up, I did the ends as well, and I just used a smaller brush to get into all the nooks and crannies, and you can see I got a nice bit of rust on those end platforms and on the ribbing and everything else. It's working down the slope sheet there. Same thing on this end. It's all nicely built up. There's a little spot there I got to correct, but I'll come back to that. But overall, it's pretty much prepped and ready to go. Now the next step here is actually doing the weathering on the sides, and if you remember in the prototype photo, it's very grimy. The first thing we need to do is apply a base coat of acrylic, and this will be a good base. It'll also darken up the sides a little bit, and it's a relatively quick process. In this case, since I've painted the top and the bottom with the earth brown, I'm going to return to the earth brown using it full strength, and I have a large dry Citadel brush. I'm going to take a little bit of this paint, load it into my bristles like this, and I'm going to go transfer to my mixing bowl to make a nice light wet wash. Now, the key with this wash is to get it all over the side of the car like this. Make sure to get it in all the little areas here. And just kind of fan it out a little bit like this. And as it starts to kind of dry up, pick up a little bit more paint, a little bit more water. Something else we're going to have to do to this car is we're going to have to actually paint the weld seams on this car, because they're much darker than the car body color, and we'll tackle that next. But first we're going to do the wash. So basically you can see you apply the paint to the side, clean your brush off, and then you take your brush and you basically go down the side of the car like this and roughly streak that paint down like this. I might clean my brush off a few times if I start getting a little too much paint. But again, there are a lot of runs down the side of this car, so I want this wash to be pretty heavy. But right there, you can see how much good that's done. It's already darkened and changed the tone of the car body side to the correct color. Now in this case, I want to keep these FURX patches relatively clean, so I'm just going to take a quick Q-tip wash here and just kind of very gently and carefully wipe these off just real fast. I want to weather these separately with the oils, and I'm going to keep them kind of clean. So for now we'll just wipe the majority of that wash off. The wash is going to be concentrated on the side. So we're going to let that dry up, and then we'll come back and we'll paint the seams. So a car like this that has these really obvious weld seams, these things will usually collect a lot more grime and rust than the side panels over time, because they're almost like channels. So what ends up happening is the rust will kind of gather them, and in this case how I'm going to replicate this is by taking a fine tip brush, one of my trusty Atlas 10Os, and I'll take the Rush Brown acrylic straight out of the cap, and I'm going to brush paint these just like this. If you're going to use powders, you could of course do this with powder, and I've done it a number of times that way anyway. But usually for lighter cars, for something heavier like this, I'll generally try to stick to the paint every single time, because the paint gets it filled in pretty quickly. And I'll generally do this kind of at a midpoint, but kind of between weathering coats. That way I can paint these on and then blend them in a little bit with the finishing weathering touches, basically to kind of blend them in a little bit more. Because right now these are pretty pronounced. They're going to stand out quite a bit. They still look pretty good, but they're very, very prominent, as you can tell. So this is just kind of the base effect. I'm going to do this for each one of these panel seams, and then once we come back with oils, it'll all kind of blend together. For the top, now I'm going to be applying all the oil on the inside underneath this walkway, and then we'll work it down. So first off, what I'm going to do is wet my brush with a little bit of thinner. I'm going to load my bristles with the oil, and I'm going to be going with a pretty heavy layer of oil here. Pretty much just like I was doing with those Intermountain 4750s I was working on. I just pretty much will load up all the oil paint underneath like this, and I'm going to completely coat that entire upper area just like this. Now it's important when you do this, you only work in small sections at a time, because when you apply it like this, it has a tendency to kind of dry and set up pretty quick, and it'll leave like little imprints, and you want to kind of avoid that. So once you get most of that paint in, switch up to a clean brush to kind of spread it out a little bit. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of streak it down a little bit with a flat bristle brush. I'm going to pull all that paint down. And you can see it real quickly. You get this nice running rust. Work that a little bit more. And it starts to kind of come down. And I'm going to kind of clean some of the extra paint off that sill, because I'm not ready to touch that just yet. I'm going to kind of clean that off. And then we can kind of proceed down the top of the car until I get all this coated up. So again, just take your time with a step, basically a step like this, and get everything covered. And again, it'll only take you a few minutes if you do it right. But it's one of these things where you want to do it right the first time and not have to redo it. So just go in and kind of just pat the paint in there. You don't have to use a lot of pressure, and just work it in under those walkways. Now we'll start pulling that paint down the side. So what I want to do here is only work in small layers at a time, so I'm going to be using a smaller brush to do this. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of this oil, and I'm going to start really quickly working it down the side like this. And again, I'm going for real heavy streaks of rust here. Now the benefit with doing it this way and only working in small sections at a time is that you won't have to work such a large area to death, because then you risk pulling up underlying layers. Now it should be noted I did dull coat the acrylic layer, I forgot to mention that, underneath, but even still, if you work this thinner and this paint over that over and over again, you will start lifting the clear coat back off, revealing this underlying layer of acrylic, and you'll start peeling it off. Unfortunately, I made that mistake on this side, and as you can see, it didn't turn out too good, and I actually have some spots now that I gotta fix where the paint underneath is visible. It still created a really cool effect, but this is why you have to be careful when doing that, because I actually did too much brush work too quick and then it peeled the paint up. So this is something you got to avoid. Still a cool technique though on the end, because I got the really cool scratching effect that I wanted to by taking a brush, and I just basically went like this while the paint was still setting up to kind of get some cool scratching effects. So it still worked out okay, and it still looks pretty damn cool. But again, it's just something you want to kind of be careful with so you can avoid it. Alright, well, it's really starting to look good now as it's coming along here, as you can see. But now we need to finish up the roof portion of the car before we reinstall the roof walk. And what I'm going to do is do a very heavy layer of oil. This is non-diluted, full strength, and this is where it usually will take up a lot of paint. But in this case, I'm going to completely coat the entire roof of this car with the oil like this. And this is where you can kind of apply it in a small section and then just kind of work it down a little bit like this, just until you have everything completely covered. And as you can see, these oils, you know, you can kind of keep stretching them. I probably need to pull out a little bit more paint for this, but as you can see, it's working out just fine. I'm just going to kind of continue to work this down. And I'll have to get some more paint for that. Basically, the technique here is after you've gone in and applied the paint, then you can go in and just kind of blotch it out like this, and you'll get a really nice texture. Work out all of your brush strokes and everything like that. Get everything really well worked in. You'll get a nice blotchy, rusty effect here. And once it dries, it'll be nice and flat, and you'll have this really good color. These oils are really good to work with here, and you can really work them in as much as you want. They don't really spread around much, but you have a lot of time with these oils to set up to go in and really work them to get them what you want. So here you can see there's a lot of good texture there when you look at that, and there's a lot of good color. And once we have the hatchback on, it'll look something like that, which will be pretty cool. So I'm also going to be rusting up the roof walks as well, both ends, both sides, with the same oil. And this is because the walkway on the prototype is very rusty, so I'm going to paint all this up, and then after this it'll be time to just let the car dry for a couple days, and then we can come back, and then the next portion, the next step rather, will be to paint the graffiti that I showed earlier onto the sides. That'll be the next step. Then we can come back in and start doing the fine detailing, the brushwork, get the trucks finished up, and basically wrap this car up.